This month's edition of the Ninja Tune podcast finds our producer Jack Smith in conversation with Annie Gavrilescu of the charity Help Refugees. Ninja Tune staff were recently volunteering in the town of Calais, northern France, playing a small part in the inspirational work that a number of charities are doing there in aid of refugees. In this interview, we try to get a better idea of the challenges charities are facing and why their work is becoming increasingly vital, even as the conditions of refugee populations fade from the headlines. The music in the podcast is provided by the Calais Sessions, an album recorded in a makeshift studio in the so-called jungle, a former migrant and refugee camp that once stood on the outskirts of town. You can find the album by searching the Calais Sessions in Bandcamp, with all proceeds going to Citizens UK. The opening track is a recent recording of R4 an Eritrean migrant living in the woods around Calais who had made his own krar, a type of traditional Eritrean guitar, out of scrap materials. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.
So, Annie of Help Refugees, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Recently a bunch of Ninja Tune staff came to visit your warehouse in Calais where you guys are doing some pretty incredible work. What do you consider the mission statement of Help Refugees and whereabouts are you active on the ground?
The way that we operate is by providing emergency aid to refugees in the Middle East and Europe mainly. But it doesn't really stop there. We also try to advocate for their fundamental rights to be respected, and we advocate for long-term solutions that will actually prevent organisations like us, part of the grassroots movement, to have to fill in the gaps left by governments and big NGOs. So we go for emergency aid and advocating for long-term solutions. And we do that in 10 different countries, including France, Serbia, Italy, Greece, Lebanon, Turkey, Syria. And that's been in 2.5 years since we started.
Around how many displaced people are now in northern France? And if you can even put a number on it, and how does that kind of compare to when the Calais jungle was at its peak?
Well, in the old jungle, we actually used to do monthly censuses of the population there, and the peak of the population that we observed and counted was just over 10,000. So that was in September 2016. At the moment, there are around 700 refugees in Calais, around 200 or 300 in Dunkirk. However, because there's such high mobility between northern France, Paris, other small camps, and even Brussels, there are probably in the region of maybe 1,500 to 2,000 refugees. In the area, it's just that they're constantly on the move, constantly being chased from place to place.
I think that was the most surprising thing about it. Some of the work that you're obviously doing in the warehouses, or that your volunteers are doing, is sorting out tents that have been kindly donated by people, obviously, all across Europe and elsewhere. Yet, when actually going out into the field, didn't see any tents. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit as to why that is.
The French authorities at the moment are obsessed with preventing what they call a fixation point. And to you and me, and just normal people speak, the fixation point might mean a camp, and that's perfectly understandable. Nobody really wants another jungle like before. However, the way that they're interpreting that fixation point concept is kind of strange. They see it as anything that enables people to settle, enables people to survive in northern France. So any semblance of settlements like tents, sleeping bags, blankets, and even last year in March, the local mayor actually essentially criminalized the distribution of food. to refugees in the area, using the exact same excuse. And when they banned the distribution of food, it was absolute chaos. One volunteer got arrested. And that's just kind of symptomatic of how much the authorities want to prevent any kind of settlement in the area. There's a lot of intimidation. There's constant confiscation and destruction of property. It's relentless.
You mentioned another charity that operates out of your warehouse in Calais. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the charities that share that space.
So we started the warehouse when we first went down to Calais with l'Auberge des Migrants, who are a local charity. They've been going for almost 10 years now. And at the time, they were just a group of retirees who were a bit scared of the British invasion of volunteers who just descended on them. But since then, so many other organizations have joined us, like the Refugee Community Kitchen, since December 2015, who've been providing food for refugees in northern France since then. Every single day, they haven't missed a day of service. Then we have the Refugee Infobus, who empower people with technology, and they let them charge their phones and have Wi-Fi to call home, and give them information about asylum routes in the UK and France. Then we have the Refugee Youth Service, who are leading our child protection team with a legal advisor and a social worker, trying to get kids into the child protection system or referring them to the legal routes available to the UK. Then we have Utopia 56, another French organisation who we share all the distribution work with, and they work in a few cities in France and Paris. And then we have the Refugee Women's Centre, who look after women and families and kids in Dunkirk and Calais. And more recently, the School Bus Project, who literally have the most beautiful double-decker bus. And it provides a sort of safe space for people to just be with each other. They have lessons on the second floor. And yeah, that's our big happy family.
What do you think, either on a more national level or local level, authorities could be doing to make this work easier?
Well, first of all, on the distribution of food, when President Macron came to Calais, he gave this hour-long speech. And part of that, he announced that the state would take charge of the distribution of meals in the region. That was a surprise to everybody, including his own staff, which is why we actually think that he made a mistake in saying that, and now they're all scrambling to kind of make it happen. But until and unless that happens, it's Refugee Community Kitchen who are still making 2,500 meals every single day, and they're the only source of food for refugees in northern France still at this point, and they operate from our warehouse in Calais. Even if it's a mistake, that is a sign that perhaps the state is actually able and might at some point be willing to take responsibility for the refugee situation in northern France. The problem is, of course, that the situation in Calais means that there have been refugees and migrants in the area for over 20 years. Clearly, their strategy of deterrence is not working. They were using a strategy of deterrence when the jungle was there, and they're using one now when there's 800 people It's clearly not working. It's just making life hell for those who are there. The people that come to Calais, come for specific reasons, and trying to deter them in the first place just will never work. There are proposed legislation reforms on asylum and immigration going through the French Parliament at the moment. They haven't got support from any side of the argument. The right think that it's not hard enough on immigrants. The academics, immigration lawyers, human rights defenders, NGOs think that it's incredibly damaging to refugees, and that it will probably be counterproductive and lead to more people coming to Calais, trying to get to the UK. So all in all, I think the one thing that their overall strategy's been missing for the past 20 odd years is any shred of compassion. If you look at Greece, the people are so incredibly welcoming. There are so many more refugees there, and the country itself economically is not doing well, and yet the people are more than able and willing to welcome people into their homes, into their society. It's a beautiful thing to see. If the French authorities, or even if the French public spearheaded that and learned from that, maybe that would change things.
Is the way that the Greek government dealing with the crisis any better? And if so, what could other countries in the EU learn from the way that they're dealing with it?
Well, the differences are many.
Yeah.
The main one, I think, perhaps being that Calais has been so politicized. It is a political crisis. I don't like referring to Calais or even the whole refugee situation in Europe as a crisis, because that denotes that we cannot deal with it, that we cannot handle it, that we don't have capacity to handle it. And that's not true. Europe is more than able to deal with this number of refugees. It's just that our governments are not willing to do it properly, out of fear that more will come, that will attract more, instead of actually recognizing how vulnerable people are who have to flee and are looking at us to seek refuge. So yeah, the differences are many. The fact that there is a network of local helpers who actually host people secretly. However, in France, it can actually be deemed illegal if you host people without papers in your home. If you have people without papers in your car, it's called an offence of solidarity. People have been convicted of that. So it is a societal problem in the sense that the authorities are very much driving the public attitudes and the public perceptions, and they are pushing those who are willing to help into a corner and ostracizing them.
I mean, talking of public perception, in your time working with Help Refugees, have there been any sort of key moments that you could pick out or are kind of at the forefront of your mind where you've seen a sea change in public perception of, if we're not calling it a crisis then, the either an influx of donations or where you've seen a sort of softening of the rhetoric around it?
I've seen both sides of that coin, to be honest. Around the time that Help Refugees started, because we only started in September 2015, that was a turning point. It felt like so many people were just tired of seeing people having to flee their homes, pouring into Europe, and for a second recognise that as, yes, a large number of people, but people who needed help. And that is when so many volunteers, ended up in Calais. That's when Help Refugees started. That's when the grassroots movement really took, had momentum. In terms of influx of people in Calais itself, it was the population was just steadily growing at all times. From the summer of 2015 to the summer of 2016, there were just so many people, and all through that winter, the flow of people didn't stop. In terms of softening attitudes, I think I'm maybe more of a cynic, and I can pinpoint many more moments when the attitudes have actually turned negative. in fact, we managed to get into law the Dubs Amendment as part of the immigration bill, which would allow unaccompanied children, refugee children, to be safely transferred to the UK. That became legislation. And I remember when the first transfer started happening, in the Daily Mail front page had pictures of children's translators, men in the old jungle camp, children's families, brothers, and said, this facial recognition software puts them at 32. Well, maybe they were that age because they were not actually the children that you were claiming to portray. Like in the old jungle, there were children as young as 8 completely on their own. Boys, 8-year-old boys on their own in Europe's biggest illegal refugee camp, Europe's biggest shantytown. And at the end of the camp, there were 1,500 kids on their own. And yet, because of that one front page and how big a deal that got made of, there was definitely a shift against helping child refugees. And I don't know if we've recovered since then. Whenever we get, really trolling comments about the work that we do, they always reference, are they actually children? Well, if you were doing my job, you'd know. Yeah, there are.
I actually remember around the time that those front pages were appearing, and it was being taught. It came up as I think it was Yanis Varoufakis was on Question Time. It was up in South Shields or somewhere in England, and yet in the same way that questions like questions about housing policy or benefits or whatever they were debating on that show. One of the questions was, do you think it should be compulsory for all child refugees coming to the UK to have an age test? With the work that you guys are doing, yes, it's about helping people on the ground, but you're also sort of fighting a PR war about how the people that you are trying to help. Has there been any pushback from politicians saying, I would love to do something to help, but I'm worried about how it would be perceived within the press?
Not explicitly, because the political figures that are on our side are very vocally on our side, and the people who are not on our side just ignore us or tell us we're wrong. But in terms of the age test, the UK does have an age test, and every child that comes through Calais or by any other legal route or informal route, every child will have to be subjected to an age test. And that age test has been demonstrated to be incredibly damaging over and over again. There is so much literature, so many studies done, from the Refugee Council to grassroots groups, to academics, to psychologists, explaining how being tested and prodded and being questioned and being assumed to be a liar is more damaging to the mental health of displaced people, especially underage children, than maybe even parts of their journeys or the original reason that they had to flee. It's incredibly damaging because you reach a place of safety and you think you've made it, you think you're finally safe, and then you're just told you're a liar, constantly over and over again by the Home Office.
بخلقت بکن رازو نیازه مادر 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 دعا کنه مگم پیشی الله جان مادر خداوند مرا با تو رسانه مادر 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 جان نور دیده مادر مرا دعا بده میرم با سنگر مادر مادر.
The way that European politics has shifted, it's like the what used to be considered the centre-right parties, and even in some way the centre-left parties, are now so worried about being politically outflanked by the far right, whether it's Alternative for Deutschland or UKIP or Front National, that they've almost been bullied into not kind of ever voting with their conscience.
There's definitely a danger that the far right is winning by intimidating centrist parties, like you said. And the effects of that are being seen exactly in, the immigration reforms that are going through the French Parliament. They're being seen on the fact that the Dubs Amendment scheme was actually closed by Amber Rudd, our Home Secretary. The fact that it's taken us, Help Refugees, taking the Home Office to court to reconsider some of those restrictions. And we're still taking them to court.
A lot of our listeners might not know a lot about the Dubs Amendment. So I was just wondering if you could, give a small outline of what it is, basically what we promised as a country, what we did, and what we are now doing through.
So the Dubs Amendment came. It was actually championed by Lord Alfred Dubs, who was a child refugee himself. He was on the Kindertransport in the Second World War, and he was also president of the Refugee Council for many years. And he actually worked out what the UK's fair share of child refugees from Europe would be, considering the fact that in, I think, 2016, 90,000 child refugees had entered Europe. They were unaccompanied. So he proposed that the UK take 3,000 child refugees without family already in the UK. There is another legal route, which is called family reunification under the Dublin III Convention, which allows children to be reunited with their parents or spouses, or children with their aunts and uncles, etc., or siblings, across European borders. However, that process itself takes so long and is so bureaucratic, and it doesn't actually provide a solution for those who don't have any family but are equally or even more vulnerable. The amendment was proposed with that 3,000 number. The government came back and said we cannot have a number on it, but we will concede that we have to take some. We will have to consult the local authorities on their capacity, which was fair enough. However, the reason that we're now taking the Home Office to court was over how they implemented that. They didn't actually consult Northern Ireland. They didn't really consult Scotland. They didn't really consult Wales. The local councils that they did consult, many of them came back to us when we started the proceedings and told us we didn't know there was a deadline on the consultation. We didn't know which format to send it in, so our numbers were not being counted. And a Freedom of Information Act request showed that over 1,000 spaces at the time that we started the proceedings were still unfilled. So it went from what the public assumed would be 3,000. That didn't happen. They made a promise that 3,000 children and vulnerable people from the region, the sort of Lebanon, Jordan, Syria region would be taken. That hasn't happened either, but, we'll get on that later. And so far, around 220 children have been transferred, pretty much all of them, with a handful of exceptions, during the demolition of the Calais jungle. And that only happened because they were so scared, because they had been shamed into it. In February last year, so in 2017, they actually put a cap on that at 480, but only after we made so much noise about the original cap of 350 that they founded an administrative error that added 130 places on top of that. So either way, there are now 260 places that are still unfilled under the government's own quota. We are challenging that capped number anyway. The problem with that was that the eligibility deadline for the Dubs Amendment was the date of the EU-Turkey deal, which was the 20th of March 2016. It's almost been 2 years since then, and so many children, thousands of children, have grown out of that eligibility. Children have been refused and have never been allowed to appeal in any way. All of the children that came from the Horn of Africa, for example, that are now in Calais, that came through Libya and Italy, that horrendous, dangerous route, they had nothing to do with the EU-Turkey deal, and yet they were arbitrarily under the same deadline. That was only lifted a couple of weeks ago, and that is again because we made so much noise about how damaging that deadline was, and the fact that a 15-year-old boy died in December last year in Calais in a hit-and-run accident. When he could have been in the UK, he actually had family here. He could have been here through any of the legal routes. And yet, he was abandoned like many, many others. And only then they lifted the deadline and set it to January this year. That means that will actually allow 260 places to be filled. We are very much persisting in suing the government. We do that quite a lot because there shouldn't be a capped number on how many children we take in safely, and we prevent them from dying at any borders. There is absolutely no reason why local authorities cannot keep the scheme open as and when they have spaces available. A government paper actually said that there is no shortage of foster families for these children. There is no reason why we just cannot just keep taking children that need our help. No reason at all.
Jesus, 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 Getae, 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 Amlake, 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 ምን እላለሁ በዓይኖች ታይቻለሁ፣ ምን እላለሁ በጆሮ ተሰምቻለሁ፣ ምን እላለሁ በእጆች ተይዣለሁ፣ ምን እላለሁ በክፍ ገብቻለሁ።
Is the UK government doing its fair share, and how does it compare to other countries that have similar schemes?
We are doing terribly, terribly. The UN actually essentially sent a message to the Home Secretary telling her that we need to double our quota of vulnerable people that we take. That are taken through the UNHCR legal route from the region or from their countries of origin. We are so behind our quotas. The number of people that we've taken through the Syrian Vulnerable People Scheme, the relocation scheme, is 53. It's tiny.
Just for some context for people, like, is there another country where you know the number so we can just compare that?
Yeah.
Rather paltry 53.
So 53 is one specific scheme.
Yeah.
Our sort of quota is, I think, 20,000 by 2020. There are 65 million displaced people in the world today. 23 of them are refugees. The others are internally displaced. Of those, about 1.5 million are in Europe at the moment. There is a camp in Kenya, in Dadaab, that has 400,000. Turkey has over 2 million Syrian refugees right now. Lebanon has a population of refugees that is a quarter of its own population, and they are doing that with open hands. Europe and the UK are actually helping a minuscule number of these refugees who need help, and the number of displaced people that need help. Which is why I hate this word crisis, because to refer to Calais or to Greece as a crisis is wrong. It's not a crisis because we cannot handle it. Maybe it's a crisis because we will not handle it. That's the problem. The fact there are maybe 1,500 refugees in northern France right now, that is minuscule. That is absolutely minuscule. The fact that we are not dealing with it with any kind of humanity is just criminal. And now with the horrible news coming out of eastern Ghouta in Syria, it's very clear that, you know, wars will not stop ravaging. Climate change refugees, that is coming. There are so many people that we could be helping, and we are in the richest, wealthiest, most privileged part of the world, and yet it's developing nations like Lebanon, like Jordan, like Kenya, who are actually bearing the brunt of this. It's pretty shameful.
That's a really interesting point. What I wanted to expand upon, because it's something I've done a little bit of reading into, but something that maybe I know I hadn't considered previously. But the idea that this is going to, you are right that we shouldn't be calling it a crisis as well, because people are migratory, and the idea that we went for thousands of years without even passports, so the idea that people don't move around is just a fiction. But more importantly, it's something that we have to legislate for, because as you say, one of the defining challenges of the coming century is that climate change is going to create more refugees than war ever could. Do the authorities have any idea about how many people are currently refugees as a result of climate change?
Well, technically, at the moment, under the current definition of what a refugee is, it doesn't include that. A refugee, according to the current definitions, and that kind of is symptomatic again of how we're not prepared for what's next. We actually have the opportunity now to be a little bit proactive and look ahead, and we're not doing that at all, and it's gonna come back and bite us. But yes, a refugee under the current definition is somebody who's had to flee and is outside of their country, and they are at risk of persecution and serious harm because of their ethnicity and race and sexual orientation, part of a social group, religion, etc. We will have displaced people who will come to wealthier parts of the world, and that is because of the direct actions of these wealthier parts of the world. And yet our legislation, our border system, our governments, our economy, we're not even preparing for it. It's ordinary people trying to solve things, and so many people suffering at the hands of that. It just baffles me.
You've just come back from the warehouse in Calais. Nothing really prepares you for the fact that it's no longer a camp of people that are able to settle, and it's not even small camps of people in tents. The problem is actually that there are thousands of people sleeping on the streets.
In the woods.
Like,
in the woods.
The help that you're providing isn't really to give these people quality of life. It's to give them the most basic level of quality of life that that anyone would expect.
We get accused quite often, actually, of the fact that we are attracting people to Calais, the fact that we are enabling them to stay there for longer. And more recently, by the lovely mayor of Calais, she publicly and repeatedly said that she would like to see NGOs prosecuted and accuse us of arming refugees. She's pretty ludicrous. In any case, we get accused of this stuff all the time, and I try as much as I can to explain. We are literally trying to meet people's most basic needs. We cannot give them shelter. As a collective, we can give them hot food. As a collective, we can give them, secondhand clothes. We can give them a sleeping bag. We can give them a tent maybe, and that will have, a lifespan of a few days. But nobody comes to Calais or stays in Calais for a plate of rice or an old pair of trousers. Nobody. These are people who are constantly on the run. They are being chased by the very people who are meant to be protecting them. I'm terrified of what this is doing to people's mental health. And I'm terrified because I know to some extent. I have this sort of saying that nobody who comes to Calais and stays as a refugee for any length of time will leave there without some form of PTSD. And that is because to a few people, Calais is almost the end of the road. And the end is so close. And yet it's one of those places where the neglect and abuse from authorities is so unbelievably and unexpectedly common that it really breaks people. If you meet them and you stay with them for a while, you see them deteriorate. I had a friend who was a child when he finally made it to the UK and turned 18 while in the care of the state. He had been abandoned by the Home Office during the whole chaos of the demolition of the jungle. And he was going through all of those tests and all of those interviews and all that scrutiny with the Home Office. And he ended up taking his own life last year. And that came after a long battle with severe depression, with so much self-doubt that he just didn't think he should live anymore. And I'm absolutely terrified of that, what that will do to all of these young people, because they could be 14, 15, 16, 17, they could be 19 or 20. It will affect them for the rest of their lives.
When we recently came to volunteer in the camp, we being a select group of Ninja Tune staff, there was a incident that had happened very recently where a young boy had been blinded in one eye in an incident involving the Calais authorities. Do you guys have any more details about what is happening with that, and how does it kind of link into the wider issue of increasing incidents of police violence?
So what happened with this boy was that there was a large-scale clearance at one of the big distribution points, and we think it was a new company of CRS. They were a bit on edge, and they started shooting tear gas canisters into the crowd, both volunteers and refugees. And unfortunately, either a tear gas canister or a rubber bullet hit this boy in the eye, and he lost it. He almost nearly lost his other eye as well. He had a huge skull fracture. He's still in hospital and being treated. The violence in Calais is pretty relentless. It comes from the police. There are tensions between communities. That's not, we won't brush over that. It does happen. There are tensions from these smuggling networks. There are just tensions because it's really cold and horrible and people have nothing. It's full of very friendly individuals in a very difficult situation. Hostility is pretty unescapable from all angles.
Hallelujah, menisane halamen. Hallelujah, ulun cheleran. Hallelujah, Yordanos elmamen. Hallelujah, kundu kafala ma'badun demo qale hasaza. Hallelujah, menisane halamen. Hallelujah, ulun cheleran. Hallelujah, Yordanos elmamen. Hallelujah, kundu kafala ma'badun demo qale hasaza.
One common story that was quite pervasive among many of the migrants living in these camps, when the jungle was initially broken up and burned down by the authorities, a lot of them were offered the opportunity to go to other parts of France, ostensibly to be able to apply for asylum.
There were people living in the old jungle who already had asylum in France. They had papers. It's just that they weren't given a place to stay. They weren't given any accommodation, any services available to them. And when the jungle was dispersed and, like you said, it burned down, the vast majority of the people did go to these accommodation centres, and the majority of them actually applied to stay in France. That, to me, was surprising. But it also showed me that if you give them the chance to go somewhere safe and to see that France is not Calais, people will very gladly take it. And it's the same now, actually. Not everybody who's in Calais wants to go to the UK. There are people who are desperate to stay in France. I met this guy, Ishmael. He I think I was with a journalist at the time, and they got talking. Ismail got a bit agitated, and he lifted his shirt up, and he showed us these enormous scars all over his torso, where he'd been stabbed by the Taliban. And he said that as soon as he got to Calais, because it's actually impossible to claim asylum in France in Calais, he went to Lille, which is a city nearby, and he went to the asylum office, and he asked to put his fingerprints down and start his application, and they told him that he wouldn't get any accommodation for 3 months, and they sent him back to the woods in Calais. There are quite a few people in that situation. And a lot of what we do, despite what the government will have you think, is trying to convince people that France is actually really lovely. They do support people. People in other parts of the country are really welcoming. It's just that Calais is toxic. The police there are brutal. And we try to make people understand somehow that even if their experience of Calais has been being beaten by police and being tear gassed and having their stuff taken and having so much hostility around, that is not the whole of France, and that the UK is not paved with gold, that the UK is not a paradise of tolerance. But it's hard to do, but we're definitely trying.
A lot of these people who are trying to claim asylum or trying to get to the UK have certain ideas about what the UK is and what exactly it is that they're going to receive when they get to these places. Who is spreading this information and who benefits from it?
We have our theories. The UK is a very profitable destination for smuggling networks. I tend to call them exploitative smuggling networks, because some, might dabble in various kinds of exploitation of the people that are paying them to be smuggled over. It isn't seen as trafficking, but its exploitation is rife. So in terms of profiting, it's definitely these criminal networks that are profiting from the misinformation, who are probably the cause of a lot of misinformation. They are actually profiting from the fact that our governments are limiting and restricting legal routes that people could take instead of having to work with these networks. There's also the fact that, the UK did go around massive parts of the world for many, many years calling itself Great Britain. That kind of stuck. So a lot of people have this dream vision of what the UK is. A land where they can be free, a land where their rights will be respected, where they will be treated as the people they really could be. And obviously that's not really true. I've met quite a few people who, they worked with the British Army as interpreters in Afghanistan, people who were completely abandoned by them. I've met children whose families, the only thing they could tell them when they sent them away, just get to the UK, I hear it's good. And because that's something that their parents told them, they have this sense of duty that they have to. Other people they just don't know. Other people have family that they cannot bear to be away from. They have friends who are the only people they have in the world. It's just such a complicated quagmire of everything. I've heard this called as not a refugee crisis, but a misinformation crisis. I think there's definitely an element of that.
I guess it's in some people's interest to make it seem as if it's unsolvable, that the problem is so big that it can only be solved through extreme means, whether that means loosening up laws around how you can treat these people, or just hoping that if you treat them badly enough, they'll just go back to where they came from.
That seems to be the preferred method at the moment. But it doesn't even have to be that extreme. If we're going to tackle this misinformation crisis, it can be as simple as actually making accurate official information available to them in their own language so they can make their own informed decisions. These people are intelligent. They have gotten this far. They should be able to make their own decisions. And yet, because there's just such a blatant lack of information, it's still grassroots groups. There's the refugee info bus who provides, Wi-Fi charging and then asylum information. It shouldn't be them doing it. Like, if you try to find information about how to apply for asylum in France or in the UK on your own, good luck with that. It's as simple as that. It just seems that every avenue possible that our governments could take to make it hard for people to be informed about their rights and have their rights respected is somehow blocked or restricted.
What advice would you give to anyone either listening or just someone that has been curious for a long time about volunteering with a project like this? Where can they find you? What skills do you need?
You don't need special skills. If you're a driver, we already want you. If you speak French, we want you. If you speak Pashto, Arabic, Tigrinya, Amharic, any of these, please, we want you. You just need to go to helprefugees.org. There's all the information you could possibly want about volunteering in France, in Serbia, in Greece. And yeah, come and say hi.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
فتصيمة تدوينة كحاسب فغرقي عبدم سرا ورئاتي زير ساعوين ملكأخي فتصيمة تدوينة كحاسب فغرقي عبدم سرا ورئاتي زللا وين ملكأخي ليلي وحليتي برخاني عيني بري بدي بعاكس عين برن نقست لبي قومات سي ليلي وحليتي برخاني عيني بري بدي بعاكس عين برن نقست لبي La 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 la. سناي جيز حلفنا يو مسكوتاتني عدبو فلا اليوم نادحار شكانا سنجر قدبو مسيل ومدا أمبر مليسنا زين الرخيب ملي متاخوخي بخيدان كنواسب مقال فرس قليبه كابا فغري دريبه ملي متاخوخي كيدان فغرنا ليلي حليتي برخاني عيني بري بدي بعاخس عين برن نقست لبي قومات سي ليلي حليتي برخاني عيني بري بدي بعاخس عين برن نقست لبي عبلي بيت سريتو ليلي ومناخي زير الساع كوين اللو صحاق مستوتاخي فتيمة تدويني كحاسب فغرقي عبدم سرها ورئاتي زلالاي وين ملكأخي فتيمة تدويني كحاسب فقرقي عبدن سراوري آتيو زللا وين ملكأخي قومات سيليلي حليتي برخني عيني بري بدي بآخس عين برن نقص لبي قومات سيليلي حليتي برخني عيني بري بدي بآخس عين برن نقص لبي